Welcome back to another video where we're going to be making a Buy Me a Coffee clone called Buy Me a Beer. This is going to be a relatively simple project, but there is tons to learn. We're going to learn about Next.js API routes. We're going to learn about creating Stripe checkout sessions. We're going to learn about Stripe webhooks, including local development. We're going to learn about creating records in Airtable. We're going to learn about listing Airtable records. We're going to deploy this application to Vercel. And you're also going to learn some TypeScript and Tailwinds along the way. So what will you need? You'll need ngrok, and this is so we can do local development with Stripe webhooks. You'll need a browser, you'll need a code editor, and you'll need a few accounts as well. You'll need a Stripe account, an Airtable account, and a Vercel account. If you need to sign up for any of these, this is a good time to pause the video and come back once you have all of these accounts set up. Let's have a look here at what it is that we're going to be building. So you can see here we have Buy Me a Beer, and we can select I either want to buy 5 beers, 3 beers, 1 beer, or I can select a custom amount. So I can go all the way up to 20 beers. I can put in my name and I can say something nice here. Now I can donate. I can grab some test card details, and you'll see here that Stripe is in test mode, and so our credit card will not be billed here. I can put in some fake details. Now if I click pay, once our payment goes through, we get redirected back to a thank you page. If we go back to our index page, you can see that we have our previous donations here. So let's get started building this Buy Me a Coffee clone. In the terminal, I'm going to say yarn create next app, and I'm going to call this Buy Me a Beer. And I'm going to give this a TypeScript flag. Of course, if you don't want to use TypeScript, then you can omit this flag. At some point in the future, if they don't already, Create Next App is going to have TypeScript out of the box. Create Next App is going to ask if we want to configure ESLint. I'm going to select yes. I'm going to cd into Buy Me a Beer, and I'm going to open this up in VS Code. Now that I have this open in VS Code, the first thing I want to do is to define my layout. So I'm going to come into Pages, and I'm going to open up the index file, and I'm going to remove everything inside of main here, and I'm going to remove the footer as well. I'm going to remove the class names from style here. And I'm also going to remove these two imports. And then I'm going to remove my styles and home.module.css. Let's open up a terminal, and I'm going to install some dependencies. If you have a look in the description below, you'll see a link to a GitHub repository. In that repository, you're going to see this notes file here. Inside of this notes file, you're going to see some dependencies that we can install. So I'm going to copy this yarn add link here. I'm going to change this one to 9.4.1. Next, I'm going to install some development dependencies, and I'm just going to install Tailwind CSS. Of course, if you're not using Tailwind CSS, you can install your component library now. The next thing I want to do is to initialize Tailwind with npx Tailwind CSS init-p. And this is going to create our post CSS config and our Tailwinds config. Inside of our Tailwind config, we need to configure this content path here. So I'm going to paste in these URLs. Next, we can go to our index page, and I'm going to give our main a class name of flex. I'm going to start this development server with yarn dev. Let's go over to the browser. And we should be able to find our main tag. And on our main tag, we have this class name of flex. And it looks like Tailwind isn't working yet. The reason for that is because we need to go into our global.css, remove all of this CSS. And we need to add this at Tailwind base, components, and utilities. Let's go try this out now. And you can see that .flex has a display of flex. So Tailwind is installed and working. So the first thing I want to do is to define some state parameters here. So I'm going to have a quantity, and this is the number of donations we're going to make. So each donation is going to be worth $5 US or whatever number you define. So I'm going to say const is equal to use state. This is going to default to 1, and this is going to be quantity, set quantity. Const equals use state. And this is going to be our name, and we also need a message. So name and set name and message, set message. I also want a error parameter up here. So equals use state. My error is going to default to null. So if we go over to Buy Me a Coffee, you can see that they have some preset values here. So they have 1, 3, or 10, or you can define a number in here. So I want to set these presets. So const presets is equal to an array, and I'm going to have 1, 3, and 5. So down inside of our main, I want to have 2 columns. So I'm going to have a div here, and then I'm going to have another div. Inside of my div, I'm going to say h1 buy me a beer. And I'm going to map through my presets. So presets.map. And I'm going to return a button. Inside of that button, I want to have my preset. And on click, I want this to execute a function that calls set quantity. And I want to set quantity with the preset value. We need a key here, and I'm just going to set the key to preset. So under our preset values, I want to have another input. And this is going to be of type number. And on change is going to execute a function, and this function is going to call set quantity. And I'm going to get my event here. This is going to be event.target.value. And quantity is a number, so I'm going to cast this to a float. So pass float e.target value. And then down below here, I want to have a button, and my button is just going to say donate with a $sign. So I want to set quantity, but I need to know what the value of a single donation is. So let's create a new file here, and I'm going to call this config.ts, and I'm going to create another file, and this is going to be called .env.local. So inside of config, I'm going to export const donation in cents is equal to process.env.next public donation in cents all 1000. So I'm going to remove that all 1000, and I'm going to call pass int on this. I'm going to use a radix parameter of 10. And if this environment variable isn't set, then I want to say or 500. And so it's going to be in cents. So 500 cents is of course $5. So now we can get our quantity times donation in cents. And then we need to wrap some brackets around that. and then we can divide that by 100 to get this into dollars. So let's go over to have a look at our page again. So you can see here, this says donate $5. If we click 5, it goes up to donate $25. We can use our input here, and it's going to go all the way up in increments of 5. So on our input here, let's set its value to quantity. So if we select 5, the input's value changed to 5. Inside of config, let's export another value here to get the maximum donation. So I'm going to say export const max donation in cents. And again, I'm going to pass this as an int. I'm going to use process.env next public, and you need to have next public, otherwise your browser's not going to be able to use this environment variable. So on our input here, I'm going to say the min is going to be 1. So you can't give me negative donations. The minimum you can give is 1. And then the max is going to equal max donations in cents divided by donation in cents. So we should be able to go all the way up to $100, and that's going to be the maximum donation. Let's see if we can go down to -1, and we can't go down any further. So the next thing we need to do is to add a name input and a message field. Let's say div, and I'm going to give this a label, and then HTML4 is going to be name. So we need an input with the type of text. Its ID is going to be name. On change, we're going to call set name. The value is going to be name. And next, we need the same thing, but we need a message. So I'm going to say message. The HTML4 is going to be for a field with an ID of message. Let's change this ID to message. And on change is going to call set message. I don't want this to be an input. I want this to be a text area. And we can remove type there now. Okay, so we have name, we have an input, and we have a text area for message. Okay, so let's go add some styles so we can see what we're working with here. So around my presets and my input number, I'm going to add a div. I'm going to add a class name to that div of flex. And you can see that they're all on one line now. I have this SVG here for a picture of a beer, and I'm going to put that in my public directory. Of course, if you want to get this SVG, you can have a look in the description below, and you'll see a link to the GitHub repository. Inside of my flex that wraps my presets and my input, I'm going to add a span. And inside of the span, I'm going to add an image. The source is going to be /beer.svg. The width is going to be 50. The height is going to be 100. And then the alt text is going to be beer. Okay, so I want another span here, because if we have a look here, we got this X here. So I'm going to add that. I'm going to copy this span, and I'm just going to say this is an X. Okay, so we have the beer icon, the X, and all these inputs. Let's add some classes here. I'm going to say items, center, and I'm going to say full W, so it goes full width. Okay, so we have our item center here. Let's add a class to this first div here, and I'm going to say this is flex1. And I'm going to add a title here. It's going to be a H2. And this is going to say previous donations. So you can see this is going the full way across the screen. On our main, let's add a max W2XL. And then I'm going to say margin auto to get it to sit into the center. And it's not margin auto, it's M auto. So now this looks a little bit better. On our buttons here, let's add some class names. So I'm going to say BG blue 500. So now these have a background color of blue. I'm going to say text white, a padding of 4. Actually, let's say padding X of 4 and a padding Y of 2. Then let's say rounded, and let's give them a margin on the right of 2. So now this looks quite good. We just need a little bit of margin here on the beer icon and the X. So let's say class name, margin right of 2. Let's copy that. And this is starting to look good. Now we need to style these inputs so we can actually see them. So on the wrapping div, let's give this a class name of margin bottom 2. On the label, I want to give this a class name of block. And then on the input, I'm going to give this a class name of shadow. Rounded W full, so it goes to full width. And let's add that onto the wrapping div as well. So this is starting to look good. We need a placeholder here so we can see what it says. So the placeholder is just going to be Tom. I'm going to add optional to the label. I'm going to add a border and a border blue 500. Now let's add some padding, so P2. So we need a little bit of a margin on the bottom of our presets and our input here. So MB is 2. And this is looking good. Just on the input here, we need to add some classes, and we can copy those from our name input. And this is just so we can see this better. Okay, so now we have a border around here. Let's copy the classes from our name input as well, and we can add those to our text area. And let's copy the wrapping div with the margin bottom and the width full as well. I want to add a placeholder to my input here. So thanks. Thank you. And I'm going to add optional to the label as well. Optional. Now let's add some class names to the button. So this is going to be BG blue 500 rounded. Give it a shadow. Let's say padding X is going to be 2. Padding Y is going to be 4. Let's swap those around actually. And let's say text white. Okay, that's starting to look quite good. Okay, so when we click donate, now we need to create a Stripe checkout session and then redirect to that session. So before we do that, let's go over to Stripe and get our secret key. So I'm here in my Stripe dashboard and I'm going to click test mode. And this is going to take me into test mode so I can make transactions without having to use a real credit card. Next, I'm going to click developers. Next, I'm going to click API keys. Then I'm going to reveal test key. I'm going to confirm my password. If you do accidentally leak these keys like I'm doing now, you can also roll these keys here. So you can click roll key, and this is going to change this key. And this is what I'm going to do once I've finished uploading this video. Next, I'm going to come to my m.local and I'm going to say Stripe API key is equal to a string. And you'll notice that I don't have next public here. And this is because I don't want to leak this API key. Let's go over to config and I'm going to create a variable for this. So I'm going to say export const Stripe API key is equal to process.env. .stripe API key, and I'm going to say as string. So inside of pages, I'm going to come into API and I'm going to rename hello here, and I'm going to rename this to checkout. I'm going to remove this data type here. You can type this correctly if you like. Next, I'm going to import Stripe from Stripe. Then I want to initialize Stripe. So I'm going to say const Stripe is equal to new Stripe. I want to put in here my Stripe API key. Then I want to put in an object, and inside of this object, I want to put my API version. And I want to set my API version to 2022.08.01. So the first thing I want to do is to enforce that this is a post request. So I'm going to say if request.method is not equal to post, then I want to return res.status, and I want to use a status code of 405, and I want to send .json with a message of method not allowed. The next thing I want to do is I want to get the quantity of donations. So I'm going to say const quantity is equal to request.body.quantity or 1. You could either say or 1 here, or you could throw an error if quantity doesn't exist. Next, I want to say const message is equal to request.body.message or an empty string. Say const name is equal to request.body.name or anonymous. Next, I need to create a checkout session. So this can throw an error because we have an async function here. And so I want to wrap this in a try catch. So I'm going to say try catch. Inside of the try block, I'm going to say const session is equal to await stripe dot checkout dot sessions dot create. We're using await here, and so our handler needs to be an async function. So my payment method types is going to be just card. But if we go into the payment method types, you can see that there is a lot of different payment method types. So if you wanted to also include affirm, you could do that as well. I'm going to have my mode here set to payment, and I need to have an array of line items. So my array of line items is each going to include an object, and inside of that object, we're going to have some price data. And inside of that, we're going to have our currency. I'm just going to set my currency to USD. I'm going to have some product data. The name of my product is just going to be a donation. So if you donate, say $25, this is going to be 5 times $5 donations. We're going to have our unit amount, and you can either hard code this to 500, but I'm going to get this from config. So I'm going to say donation in cents. And the reason that this is in cents is because Stripe expects everything to be in cents. So if you say here unit amount is going to be 5 because you want to have a $5 donation, then you're going to be charging the person 5 cents. Now we're going to have our quantity. So this is it for our line items. The next thing we want to have is a success URL. And this is going to get our request.headers.origin, and it's going to redirect to /thankyou. If you would like to include the session ID, you can also do that as well. The next thing we need to have is a cancel URL. And I'm just going to redirect to /cancel. Okay, from our session, we can get a URL. So I'm going to say const URL is equal to session.url. And I'm going to say if URL return res.status 200.send, and I'm going to send along the URL. If we don't have a URL, I'm going to respond with a 500 and something went wrong. I'm going to do that if we catch an error as well. And I'm also going to console.error, error creating session. And I also want to include the error here. Okay, so let's remove this response here. So what do we do with our name and a message here? We need to get this back in a webhook. And so we can do that by adding some metadata. So I'm going to say metadata, and this metadata is just a key value pair of whatever you like. So I'm going to put my name and I'm going to put my message. Let's go back to our index page, and I'm going to have an async function at the top. So async function handle checkout. And say const response is equal to await fetch /API/checkout. My method is going to be post. I'm going to set some headers here. My content type is going to be application JSON. Inside my body, I'm going to JSON stringify my quantity and my name and my message. Make sure you do set this header, content type application JSON. If you don't set this header, then your body is not going to be in JSON format, and you're going to have to pass that manually, and that's going to be quite annoying. So let's say const equals response.json, and we need to await this. And we're going to get our URL from here. So let's say if response.ok. Actually, let's say res, and we can say if not res.ok, then we're going to set an error of res.error. Otherwise, we're going to say const URL is equal to res.url. And I'm going to use my router. So I'm going to say imp const router is equal to use router. And this comes from next/router. And I'm going to say router.push. And I just want to push to this URL here. Okay, so let's display our error if it exists. So down below our H1, I'm going to say error. And then I'm just going to have a div with our error message. And we shouldn't ever see this error message. So let's go try this out. So I'm going to add a $5 donation. I'm going to say Tom, and our message here is changing. So I think the value of our message must be sent to name. So let's change the value of message to message. Say Tom, thank you, and donate. We'll click donate, and donate does nothing. So we need to call our handle checkout when we click donate. So let's say on click, and then we can just pass in handle checkout. Let's try this again. We get a post request, and let's have a look at the response here. We get our URL back, but we're not being redirected to that URL. So the reason we're not getting redirected is because response doesn't include OK. So let's just say if response.url, otherwise let's say if res.error, then I want to set an error res.error. And when we click this function, let's set our error back to null so we can stop showing that message when we click donate again. Okay, so let's try this again. Tom, thank you. I'm going to make a $25 donation. Now we get redirected back to Stripe. So I can use one of these test card details here. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to put this in, say t@t.com, 0132 You can just put anything you like here. The only exception is the expiry date needs to be in the future. Click pay. And we get redirected back to our thank you page, which doesn't exist yet. So the next thing we need to do is to set up our webhook. So let's come back to Stripe, and I'm going to come into webhooks here, and I'm going to click add endpoint. And now we're stuck because in this endpoint here, if we put localhost port 3000, then Stripe is not going to know what that is. To Stripe, localhost port 3000 is going to be something on their system. So we need to be able to tunnel in to our computer. So we can do that with ngrok. So I'm going to open up a new terminal, and I'm going to say ngrok HTTP, and I'm going to point this to port 3000, which is where I have my application running locally. ngrok is going to give me this forwarding address here. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste that in, and I'm going to say API/checkout complete. Now I'm going to add some events. I'm going to search for checkout, and checkout session complete is what I want to put in. Click add endpoint. Now let's go create this endpoint here. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to copy my checkout actually, and I'm going to paste that. Now I'm going to rename this to checkout complete. We can leave in this if request is not equal to post, because Stripe is going to send us a post request, but we can remove all of this stuff down here. So you might be wondering, if this API is going to be public, how do I know someone's not just going to hammer this with their own post requests? Well, we need to verify the signature of the request that's coming in to make sure it is a valid Stripe request. So to do that, we need to get the signature from the headers. So I'm going to say const signature is equal to request.headers Stripe signature, and we're going to typecast this as a string. I'm going to say if not signature, then I want to return res.status. And I want to use a 400 and missing signature. Next, I want to say let's event. And I want to type this as a stripe.event. Next, I need to get the buffer. So I'm going to say const buff is equal to await buffer, and buffer needs to come from micro, which we installed earlier. So let's import from micro, and I need to import buffer. So you may be wondering, how do I get a buffer from the request? My body is going to be JSON. So that's true, and we need to fix that. Luckily, Stripe gives us some config that we can export, and we can just say that we want a raw body. So I'm going to export const config. And this is a specially named variable here that Next is going to pick up for us. So equals an object. I'm going to say API, pass body is going to be false. And now we can get our buffer out of our request body. So let's say try and catch. Event is going to be equal to stripe dot webhook dot construct event, and we need to pass in our buffer, a signature, and our Stripe webhook secret, which we don't have. Let's come over to config, and I can say export const Stripe webhook secret is equal to process.env Stripe webhook secret. We need to add this in. So I'm going to say Stripe webhook secret is equal to, and we can get our signing secret here from our webhook. Click reveal, and I'm going to copy that. Now I can replace this with Stripe webhook secret. If we get an error, I want to return a 400 with invalid signature, and I want a console.error invalid signature And then I want to also add my error here. Now I need to verify that the event type is checkout session completed. So I want to say if event.type is not checkout session complete, then I want to return res.status 400 invalid event type. Next, I need to get my metadata. So I'm going to say const metadata is equal to event dot data dot object dot metadata. And metadata doesn't exist because if we have a look at the type, it's just data.object. An object is just an empty object. So we can wrap this in some brackets here. And I can say as an object that has metadata, and the metadata has name and message. Now we can return res.status. And I want to respond with a status code of 200 and a message of success. And let's console.log metadata. Let's try this out, and what we're expecting is to see our metadata appear in the console. Let's go back to our homepage here. And I'm going to add 5 donations. I'm going to add a name of test1, a message of thank you, test, donate. Pop in my card details and email. Let's go back to our console here. And you can see we get some metadata, message, and name is going to be test1. So now we need to send this off to Airtable. So let's come over to Airtable. And once you've signed into your account, you're going to click Add Base. I'm going to rename this base Donations. I'm going to rename the table here to Donations. I'm going to change name here to name with a lowercase. I'm going to rename notes here to message. I'm going to change the type of assignee to number. And then this is going to be amount. The reason I'm using lowercase here is just because there was no ambiguity when we're sending the data on. Do I need to say that it's amount with a capital A or amount with a lowercase a? And because we're just using it as a database, it's okay. And let's delete this last field here. Okay, so let's now go over to airtable.com/API. And their API documentation is really good. We're going to be able to select our base here. So I'm going to select donations. Now I'm going to come down to table 1 here, which I should have renamed to donations. So let's say donations, click save. We can refresh here and you can see that it's changed the name to donations table. And what we want to do is to create a record, and you can see that we get a curl request here. You can also use the JavaScript library, but I think that's pretty unnecessary given that this is so easy to follow. So the first thing I need to do is to create environment variables for my bearer token and my app here. So I'm going to copy my app. I'm going to come over to my .env. And I'm going to say Airtable app ID is equal to, I'm going to paste that in here. Then I'm going to get my bearer token here. I click this show API key, and that's why my bearer token is showing. Airtable bearer token is equal to. Now let's go over to config. And I can say export const Airtable app ID is equal to process.end.Airtable app ID as string. I can do the same here for bearer token. Actually, let's call this API key. So now I can say export const API key is equal to process.end API key as string. In my checkout session complete webhook here, I can come up to the top and I want to create a new function here. So I'm going to say async function insert to Airtable. And I want to grab this URL here. And I want to say const URL is equal to, paste that in here, and I can replace this here with my Airtable app ID. Next I can say const response is equal to await fetch. And I want to fetch my URL. My method is going to be post. I'm going to set two headers here. If we go back to the documentation, you can see that we need to set our bearer token, and we also need to set this content type is application JSON. And we need to set this as authorization and Airtable API key. It's amazing how many problems this one header causes when you don't include it. Now let's create a body here, and we can see what our body needs. It needs records, which is an array, and records has fields. So I'm going to say records, it's going to be an array. Our array is just going to have one object, and this is going to include fields. We're going to include our name, message, and amount. So we need to get these three properties here as arguments in this function. Let's type these out. Name is going to be a string, message is a string, and amount is going to be a number. So now we can return response.json. And we have a metadata here. I just need to get the amount. So I'm going to say const amount is equal to event.data.object.amount total divide by 100. The reason I'm dividing by 100 is because I want to set this back to dollars from cents. So you can see amount total doesn't exist here. We can do the same thing we did for metadata. So I can wrap this in some brackets, and I can say as a property that includes amount, which is a number. So now let's say await, insert into Airtable, and we can call this with our name, our message, and our amount. And let's just spread metadata. And let's go try this again. I'm going to come back to my table here, and I'm just going to remove all of these fields so we insert into the first column here. Go back to localhost, make sure I get a credit card, make a $5 donation for Tom, and I'll put in some data here. Fill this out, t@t.com. And if we watch this table, we should see it insert, and you can see that it inserts just here. So the next thing we need to do is to get our data from Airtable. So I'm going to create a new API endpoint. Actually, let's copy this one, and I'm going to rename this donations. And I can remove this config block here. I want to make sure this is a GET request. And then I can remove the rest of this body here. Actually, let's just leave our response here for now. Let's go back over to Airtable documentation, and you can see we have list records here. And again, we get this API endpoint. So let's copy that. And I can say const response is equal to await fetch. I'm going to put my URL in here, and I'm going to use some backticks so I can replace my app here with my Airtable app ID. I want to make sure this is a get method. I need to set some headers, content type, application, authorization. Now I can say const data is equal to await response.json, and we can see what this is going to return. So let's copy this actually. And we can come over to this generate TypeScript here. I'm going to paste this in, and now I want to copy this type here. I'm going to create a new file called types.ts, And inside of fields, we're going to have our name, we're going to have a message, and we're going to have an amount. And we can type our response here as Airtable record. So I can say as Airtable record. Now I want to return data.records. So let's try this out in the browser. I'm going to go over to localhost port 3000/API/donations. And you can see that we get our donations here. Let's go insert another one. So I can say this one is Bob. Bob says, thank you. And Bob's donated $100. Refresh this. And you can see that we get another record here from Bob with a message of fan. I think there must be a debounce on the update here. So if we refresh again, you see we get thank you and the amount. So on our index page, I want to fetch these donations. So I'm going to export const get server side props is equal to an async function. And this async function needs to return an object with props, which needs to be an object. And I'm going to populate our donations here. So I'm going to say const response is equal to await fetch, and I want to fetch from /API/donations, and this is not going to work, and I'm going to show you why in a second. So const donations is going to be equal to response.json, and let's put that in, save. Let's go refresh our home page here, and you can see that we get an error. The reason is because when you're making a GET request with fetch, you need to put in the absolute URL. So to fix this, one, we need to type context. So let's type this here. So this is going to be get server-side props. Now we need to get the protocol and we need to get the host URL. So I'm going to try to get this out. Context.request headers.protocol. Let's console.log what is in context, and we can hard code this for now. Localhost port 3000. Let's refresh our page here, and let's have a look what's in context. Let's have a look what's in context.headers. So context.request.headers. Refresh. So we have some cookies. We have our host here. We just need to get our host protocol. So our protocol that we're looking for is HTTP. So you can see here we have underscore protocol. So let's see if we can get dot underscore. So it looks like we can get this from context.request.headers exported for protocol, or we're going to set it to HTTP. Let's just double check and make sure that is correct. So we have our protocol here, which is HTTP. Okay, so now we can replace this with context.request.headers.host, and we can add our protocol at the start here. So protocol, and then ://. We can remove this console log here, refresh. And it looks like we don't get any errors. And so our donations here should be populated. Let's come up to the top here and we can say donations is going to be part of props. And our donation is going to be of type record here. And it's going to be an array of record. And record comes from types. Okay, so let's json.stringify this and just make sure that this is all correct. And you can see here we get an array of donations. So now we can just map through this and print them out. So I'm going to say donations.map. Return a div. We're going to get a donation. Each div needs to have a key. We're going to have donation.id. Then we're going to have donation.fields.name. We can say donated, donation.fields.amount. Now we can add a break tag and we can say donation.fields.message. Add some classes on here. So I'm going to say padding is going to be P4 and shadow and a margin bottom of 2. Okay, so we have each one of our donations here. So it says Bob donated $100 with a message of thank you. So the next thing to do is to deploy this application. So I'm going to come into my terminal. I'm going to say rm rf.git, and this is just going to make sure we're working with a clean Git. So let's come over to GitHub. And I'm going to create a new repository. I'm going to call this buy me a beer. It could just be a public repository. Now we need to run git init, git add, and git commit -m with a message of first commit. We need to set the branch to main. We need to add the origin, and then we need to push to the origin. Let's say git init, git add dot, and we need to make sure our .env.local wasn't added here. So if we have a look in git ignore, we should see .env.local, and that has been omitted. We can say git commit -m, and we can say first commit. Next we can say git branch -m, set that to main. We need to set the remote repository. And then finally, we need to push. Now, if we refresh this, we can see our code here. I'm going to come over to Vercel. I'm going to click Add New Project. I'm going to get my project from GitHub. I'm going to import Buy Me a Beer. And I need to set some environment variables. So I'm just going to get these out of my .env. I'm going to replace these later on with my correct environment variables. So my production Stripe secret and webhook key. But I'm going to do that after I've released this video. So I'm just going to split my screen here. So I can say Stripe API key. It's going to be equal to this key here. My Stripe webhook secret. My Airtable app ID. And then my Airtable key. Now let's click deploy. And this is only going to take about a minute or so. So now Vercel has finished deploying this application. I can click on this URL and you can see my application is up and running. So that is how to make a Stripe and Airtable integration using Stripe checkout sessions, webhooks, and using Airtable as our database. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up and let me know in the comment section below what you do with Stripe and Airtable. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.